looked at me, and I was just angry. I thought, how dare they? How dare they expect me to take this little boy into my home when I just lost my 2 little girls and I miss him so terrible. Well, Jed said, okay, so do we call you Daniel or Danny? And he said, well, Daniel's the name I get scolded by. I'd much rather be called Danny. And everybody laughed. But I couldn't even look at Daniel. I couldn't feel his pain. My heart was too full of my own pain. And I looked towards the mountains, and all I could see was my little girls running through the sagebrush and laughing and giggling, and I walked away. So that first night, this little boy Daniel comes into our cabin. He doesn't even have any manners. I mean, I served him Johnny cake and greens, and he just gobbled with both hands like he had never seen a fork before. And I thought, how could I possibly love this little boy? And then he reached for more Johnny cake and he spilled milk all over the table. I mean, after all, my little girls wouldn't have done that. They had good manners. And if they'd done that, they would have said, excuse me, and wiped it up. No, he just jumps up and runs out of the cabin. Well, he wouldn't even sleep the night with us there. He had to go out and sleep in the wagon with Pastor Clay. Well, that's okay. It's all right with me. But then the next morning, Pastor Clay got up to leave, and when he realized he was supposed to stay and Pastor Clay was leaving, well, he ran right after that wagon. If Jed didn't have such long legs, he never would have caught him. But he caught him, and he grabbed him, and he says, don't you want to stay here? Don't you want me to be your pa? Well, I think Jed kind of liked the little boy. He sat down in the road with him, and he said, you got to understand something, Danny. Aunt Martha, well, it's kind of like the seasons of the world. When I met her, she was just like a summer day, and she was so happy and so much fun and so full of love. And well, then last spring when we lost our 2 little girls, she just kind of turned into winter. And now she's kind of sad and not very happy. And I promise you, Danny, if you'll stay here with us, spring will come again for this family. So they walked back to the cabin, and I just turned and walked on in to do my work. Well, it was time for Danny to have a bath. He'd been around a couple of days, and he was pretty darn filthy. And I filled the tub full of water, and I even put a kettle of hot water in it to make it nice and warm for him. And I says, come on, Danny, it's time for a bath. Get in. Well, he just stood there shaking like he didn't know what to do, like the stupid kid never had a bath before. And Jed said, well, maybe he's just a little bit nervous about having a bath in front of a woman. So she said, oh, I can turn my back. I turned around, heard some splashing in the water, and I turned around, and there was Daniel sitting in the tub with all his clothes on. Shoes, socks, hat, everything. I couldn't believe it. I said, Jed, this kid has never had a bath in his life. I can't believe it. I don't think he's trainable. I don't think we want this kid here in this house. Now, Jed said to me, settle down, Martha. He'll be fine. I'll take care of this. And Jed bathed him, and I got to do my dishes all by myself, which was just fine. My little girls never would have been like that. I decided I should try, so I made him a mattress out of straw and some ticking and put it in the corner by the fireplace so he can have a nice warm place to sleep. And he climbed into bed and he said, thank you, Aunt Martha, for the bed. This is nice. And I watched him, and he got out a little tin can that kind of opened like this and got some stuff out of it and looked at it. I didn't really know what he was looking at. Found out later that he had a coin he called his lucky penny, and he had a little switch of hair tied with a ribbon. And when he lay there on that straw mattress, he stroked that hair against his cheek every single night till he fell asleep. Because that's what he had left of his mama and his papa. So one day, our neighbors came to visit. Their name were the Tanners. And they were kind of an odd family, and I was busy, and I didn't have time for them, but you know, I have manners. So I offered Eleanor a drink of water, and she made a fuss over looking in the looking glass, how beautiful she was. And I said, you know, that mirror came all the way from France. We carried it on our wagon, and it's only got one crack in it, so be careful with it. Well, they had brought, well, they thought they were bringing me some bacon, this little pig. Well, Daniel thought that that pig was a gift for him and was his pet, and he fell in love with that pig right away, and that little pig went everywhere he went. I tried to kick the pig out of the cabin, but that just wouldn't do. I was outvoted. Jed and Daniel wanted that pig in the cabin and out of the cabin and everywhere they went. One day, Daniel and Bear, which was the name of the pig, they were out wandering in the sagebrush one day, and they found a dead bird. And Daniel felt so bad. And he picked up the bird and he held it in his hands, and he cried a little bit, and then he scraped a hole in the ground, and then he whispered something to the bird. And I found out that he whispered to the bird, "Tell my mama I miss her, please." And he put the bird in the hole and covered it over with dirt. Daniel was a nice little boy, but oh, he was rowdy. I just couldn't stand being around him. Every time I looked at him, all I could do was think of my two sweet little girls that had more manners and were kinder and were gentler and not so noisy. He was noisy in and out of the cabin all the time. Well, the neighbor boy, Tanner, he had taught Daniel how to catch snakes. So one day I was getting ready to cook dinner, and I was looking around for my kettle so that I could cook dinner. My kettle was not anywhere. I looked all around inside the cabin, and I thought, okay, Daniel has something to do with this. So I went out looking. Sure enough, he was out in the weeds carrying the kettle around from bush to bush to bush, and I grabbed it and tried to take it in the house. He wouldn't let me have it. It was like a tug of war. "No, Aunt Martha, you can't have this. No, Aunt Martha, you can't." Well, finally, I jerked it away from him and took it in the house, and I took the lid off to put my Johnny cake in the kettle. Do you know what was in the kettle? Snakes. It was full of snakes. Oh my goodness, scared me to death. I went screaming and yelling, and I said, "Daniel, you have done it now. This is the last straw. I cannot stand this one more minute." And I went out to the shed to tell Jed about Daniel and about how naughty he was. I was so upset. I said, "Daniel, if you do one more thing that you're not supposed to do, I am going to take a switch to your behind." I was just about fed up. And so when I came back in the cabin, my trunk was open, like this. And Daniel was sitting over there by the trunk. And he was going through my things. I mean, he had pulled out my shawl, the very shawl that I wrapped my baby girls in. And he was playing with one of my little girl's horse that Jed had carved for her. And he was playing with the dolly, and I was just fit to be tied. I mean, that was my stuff. That was not Daniel's stuff. He had no right to be in that trunk for any reason without permission. And I screamed and I yelled and I said, "Daniel, you have just about had it, and I'm not going to stand for this any longer. And if you get into that trunk one more time, you're going to get it." Oh, well, Daniel realized that he was in trouble. So he went out to play for a little while. Then he decided that he'd better do something good. Well, a couple days later, I was missing my quilt. I didn't know where my quilt had gone. I'd worked hours and hours and days and weeks on that quilt. Teeny tiny little pieces that I cut up from old dresses and sewn together, and I went around looking for my quilt. Daniel was in the yard. He had decided to play Indian, and he had my quilt up around some branches and was hooping and hollering and dancing around and didn't even realize that he was tromping the edge of my quilt right into the mud. Well, I just wanted to cry. I just couldn't take it anymore. And I did start to cry. And I said, "Daniel, what do you think you're doing? You're not supposed to get into my things. And that quilt is not to be an Indian tent. That is my quilt for my bed. And I went to the scrubbing tub and I started trying to scrub the mud out of my quilt. Have you ever tried to scrub mud out? Mud is the very worst thing to get out of fabric. It was just a mess, and I was upset and crying, and Danny said, I think I better do something good. And so he went over and he snuck into my trunk, and he took out the book, and he thought I was going to be happy because he was sitting over there in the rocking chair trying to read. Well, I knew he hated to read. I knew he didn't want nothing to do with that primer that I had brought all the way from the east, and that my girls love. I could sit my little girls down and they love to hear the stories in this book. But Daniel could never sit for a story, and I knew he didn't want to read, and I grabbed it out of his hand and I threw it in the trunk, and I said, don't bother. And I went out to the barn and I told Jed, I said, I've had it. This boy has got to go back to the settlement. I'm not keeping him here one day longer. Tomorrow, you are going to take Daniel and you're going to take him back to Pastor Clay. I can't live with him any longer. He just reminds me of what my little girls were, and he's not, and I can't stand it. Bright and early the next morning, the wagon was on its way to the settlement, and Jed and Daniel were riding on the seat. They had the horse and the mule, and they were trotting along, and Danny said, Pa, why are we going to town? I'm so glad we're going to town. You know, I've got this lucky penny in my little tin box, and I'm going to spend it. Well, what are you going to spend it on? Well, I'm going to spend it on getting, I didn't tell you that he broke Aunt Martha's mirror, but he did. He says, I'm going to spend it on a new mirror for Aunt Martha for Christmas. And if I've got enough money after the mirror, then I'm going to buy some writing paper for Nate, who was their neighbor who liked to draw. And Jed said, well, Daddy, where did you get that penny anyway? He said, oh, this is my lucky penny that my pa gave me, and he told me never ever to spend it. Well, then why are you going to spend it? Well, it's a lucky penny, and I need to buy things. I need to buy a gift for Martha, and I need to buy a gift for Nate, and I don't need this lucky penny anymore. Jed said, Danny, why don't you need any more luck? He says, Pa, you know I'm the luckiest boy in the whole world. He said, I've got you now for my pa. What better luck in the whole world could you have than for me to have a pa like you? Well, said Jed, I thought you liked Pastor Clay. Weren't you okay when you were living with Pastor Clay? And Danny said, oh, he was okay. He was nice. But, Pa, he didn't love me like you do. I'm so lucky, and I'm so glad I get to be here in your house with you as my pa. So they drove along a little bit further, and Jed said, oh my goodness, did you see that? I think Jasper's got a limp. Danny said, a limp? I didn't see him limp. Yes, sure enough he does. And he turned the team around and they headed back towards the cabin. He says, we cannot take these animals to town with Jasper having a limp like this. Well, I just won't do that. I'll just make him more lame. So he took the animals into the shed, and Martha saw, and she came out and she says, what happened? Well, we can't take Danny to town today because Jasper's got a limp. That's going to take a whole month to heal up. Martha went into the barn with Jed and the animals, and she said, that mule is not limping. And Jed said, if I said that the mule is limping, then the mule is limping, and we're not going to town till after Christmas. Well, said Martha, 1st of January is the last day, and you are taking that boy back to the settlement. I'm not living with him any longer than that. And she stomped into the house. Well, snow came to the cabin. It was cold, and it was especially cold in the cabin. Fireplaces in cabins weren't that warm, really. So they stayed in a lot. And one day, Jed said, I'm going over to help the Tanners with some chores. And And he was gone for a while, and he came back and he said, "Oh, Martha, you'll never believe what I found out there over the hill. I found a little tiny Christmas pine. It's not big as the ones that we used to have, but it'll do for us." And Aunt Martha said, "Oh, no, no, no." And she looked over, and Daniel was in the corner on his bed by the fireplace, and he was fiddling around with some sticks and some string, and she figured he wasn't paying attention, so she pulled Jed over into the far corner of the cabin, and she said, "I don't want to celebrate Christmas this year. I just can't bear to think of it. All I think about is our two little girls and their dolls and our decorated tree and the smell of spice cakes at the house, and it won't be that way. And I don't want to celebrate Christ's birth because he's done nothing for us this year. Nothing at all. No, Jed, I do not want a Christmas pine in this house. I won't have it." Well, Jed got mad and he stomped off. And she went back to her work doing the things that she was doing. And Jed came in after a while and he says, "I'm going back to the Tanners." "Well, what are you going to the Tanners again for? Aren't they feeling well enough now that you don't need to go help them with their chores after that bout of yellow fever?" And Jed says, "No, they need my help and I don't mind, so I'm going to go help them." So he took off, and it was snowing and it was cold, and before he left, Danny said, took the hat off his head that he always wore. It was his first Pa's hat. And he said, "Pa, you better wear this hat. It's cold out there." And he gave his hat to his daddy, and he left. Well, I set about my work, doing the things I needed to do, and I dipped some candles in the wax because we were getting real low on candles. And then I'd been working on a rug, and so I got my rug and I was finishing the work on it. And I had a pair of scissors, but they seemed to have been gone. But every time I'd, well, I can't do that either. Every time I'd break the threads and throw them on the ground, I noticed that when there got to be a little pile, Danny would come and gather the threads and take them over into the corner and do something with them. I didn't care what he was doing with them. He was being quiet. He wasn't getting my quilt dirty. He wasn't collecting snakes. He wasn't messing with my trunk, so I just let him be. And I finished tying and working on my rug, and then I decided it was time to go gather the eggs. And so I got up and I went out to the barn and out to the chicken coop, and I was gathering eggs. And when I was out there in the chicken coop, I happened to notice that Daniel ran from the house to the barn. Then he ran back. And I went on and I was giving feed to the chickens and making sure they had water, and I looked up and there again was Daniel. He was running from the house to the barn. From the barn back to the house again. Wonder what that boy is up to now. So I took my basket of eggs and I went into the house, and I noticed that my trunk was open. And I thought, okay, this is the last straw. I cannot take any more. And I went out to the wood pile and I found myself a nice long switch. And I headed for the barn. This kid is going to get it this time. I am not taking any more. And I walked up to the barn. Danny was inside the barn and I couldn't see him. He was busy doing something. And he had set up his little thing of sticks. And he had wrapped the doll in my shawl and laid it in the sticks. And there was a horse standing by, watching. And there was our cow. There was Jasper. And Daniel was sitting down here like this. And when I walked in on this scene, my heart went right into my throat. And Daniel was explaining what he had just done. And he talked about the star that was in the sky. And he talked about the baby Jesus. And he talked about how Mary was there, and Joseph was there, and all the animals were there. And the baby Jesus, he was a good little boy. And he minded his mama Mary. And he didn't collect snakes in mama's pan, and he didn't stomp her quilt into the mud, and he didn't do all the naughty things that I've done. But he was a perfect, perfect son. He was the Son of God. And then Daniel started humming. I wish I could remember that song my mama used to sing. I wish I could remember it. And I was standing at the door of the barn, and I knew what song he was looking for. And I sang, Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, round yon virgin, mother and child, holy is so tender and mild, sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly peace. While I was singing, Daniel was frozen still. He didn't move. And as soon as the song ended, he turned around and he said, Aunt Martha, that's the song I've been trying to remember. That's the one. Thank you so much for singing that song. And please forgive me. Please forgive me, Aunt Martha. I know you didn't want me to borrow your shawl and your little girl's doll and your other little girl's horse, but Aunt Martha,